Okay, let's get started. Hello, Robert. Nice to see you again. Let me unmute you. I'm sorry. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure being here.
We had you speak at our conference in Orlando many years ago.
I remember that. Yeah, that was great.
Thank you very much for coming back to speak with us again. Mary, it is nice to meet you for the first time.
Yes, very good to be here. Thank you, Steve.
Good. I watched a lot of your videos and I was very excited for the opportunity to hear you speak. And Dr. Abramson, thank you again for being willing to share your life's work with us. You spoke last year and we're very grateful to have you back again.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for having us and for doing this good work, bringing important information to a lot of people.
Great. Okay, so there's a lot we could talk about. So I'm going to ask very specific questions. And I guess we don't need to go into all the details because we could spend all the time on just one question. I want to ask you a lot. So the first question is, can you just give us a 30-second update, each of you, on what you've been doing for the last 10, 15 years and just your general focus? Just a quick update. Mary, you could start, then Robert, then John.
Sure. Am I on the mic?
Oh, we hear you, yes.
Great. So I have been mostly working with an IRB. I've chaired one for about 12 years. And for those of you who don't know what an IRB is, it's an institutional review board. It's an ethics board that looks at the informed consents and the protocols when people want to do human research and make sure that the subjects know all of their rights. And I also have done a little bit of court work, as an expert witness, and that's mostly what I've been doing in the arena in terms of science in this time period.
Okay, thank you, Robert.
Yeah, after I published Anatomy of an Epidemic in 2010, I started a web magazine called Mad in America. And basically the purpose of the web magazine is our mission statement says, we believe that our society has organized itself around a false narrative of science. In other words, what we were told about psychiatric diagnoses and the merits of the drugs is out of sync with the actual science, if you go into the scientific literature. So what we do on Mad in America is try to make known the actual scientific findings that do exist in the literature. We also do deconstructions of drug approval sometimes, and we do report on some of the corruption within the pharmaceutical industry. But our goal is to inform the public of what really is known from good science about psychiatric disorders and the merits of the drugs. And we now have affiliates in 11 countries with 4 more affiliates coming online this summer.
Thank you. Dr. Abramson?
So I spent about 10 years in litigation, national pharmaceutical litigation. And during those 10 years, I had access to the confidential corporate documents, usually around 20 million documents per case. And the hard drives from the pharmaceutical industry would be delivered and put into databases. So my job was to figure out how the studies were designed, how the analyses were planned, and to look at the data and to see if the data followed the design of the studies, and then to see how the drugs were marketed and to see if the marketing accurately represented the data, the clinical trial data. I did that. I learned a whole lot about how the drug industry works. Very little of it leaked out, got out to the public, and the information that did get out to the public was so technical that the public couldn't understand it. So I decided to write a book to help to explain how this was happening. It took me 6 years full time to write Sickening, and it was published last February. In Sickening, I tell the story about how the American doctors and patients are being misled about what the science really shows. And I've got to say, I wish I had another chapter to add to Sickening at the end to talk about how completely this message has been stonewalled by the mainstream media, so that the public does not get access to the information that shows that the crisis in American healthcare is actually costing more lives and a whole lot more money than the COVID pandemic did. And it's the ultimate emergency that's facing our nation in terms of excess deaths and in terms of excess spending that's bringing about this political turmoil that we're in now.
Okay, so a lot of people are confused right now because we're having a panel with 3 people called What You Need to Understand About the Medical and Pharmaceutical Industry to Protect Your Health. And what they're saying is, this doesn't make any sense because what we all know is that the most respected parts of society, universities and science, they do these clinical trials, which we are told are the, highest standard of credibility. They report them to medical journals, which we're told are the highest standard of checking on other people's work. The FDA themselves, a government agency, approves it. They tell it to our doctors who read all this information. The media reports this. So we are all saying we have fantastic, accurate, precise information on exactly what is safe, exactly what's dangerous, and exactly what to do. There's about 330 million Americans. There's 1 million doctors, and these doctors are the best. They've got the most perfect, accurate information based on the best science, the best studies. It's overseen by the best agencies. So no one has any idea why we're wasting time having a panel when we already get perfect, precise information. So why are you, I guess, writing books, talking about this? There's some miscommunication, and we don't really understand what's going on. So could you help us a little?
Or who wants to start?
Go ahead, Robert, you have the floor.
Well, I guess some people believe that story, and it's sort of the story that's out there, but you have to start with the fact that clinical trials, and when you're developing new drugs, they're paid for and designed by the drug companies, and they use those clinical trials. They design their trials with a couple of things in mind. One, they want to make sure they get past the FDA hurdle of approval, but they're also looking to tell a story. So they'll use design in other ways to make their drugs look better than existing drugs. And they'll use designs to hide side effects. And that's just the beginning, the design. In other words, it's not an independent testing organization. It's a pharmaceutical company who has a need to get that drug approved and into the market, and with a story that will enable it to be successful. So right away from the design, you have this basic element of corruption. Then who tests it? Then you have investigators. By the way, I looked at 7 recent drugs that were approved, psychiatric drugs. There were 187 authors on the 22 reports of those 7 drugs. The majority were company employees. So you even have the named authors of studies now are company employees. So in other words, we don't have independent testing of drugs. And what it produces is they're not really scientific assessments of the safety and efficacy. That's the problem. They're really marketing efforts. And then they pick the data and they use the data that they send to do the articles to journals. And it's really an information chain that doesn't provide good evidence or truthful science. It's an information change, a capitalistic information change that is used to make drugs sell well. And part of that selling drugs well is, in fact, to mislead about the nature of the efficacy. The efficacy is usually exaggerated, and the hiding of the harms. That's the process we have in place now.
So Steve,
Go ahead, John.
can I take it? Steve, the scenario you lay out with well-trained, hardworking, honorable doctors, and I believe all those things, relying on their reputable journals that publish peer-reviewed articles and clinical practice guidelines that explain what the totality of information is to doctors to guide their practice is a total sham. It's a complete hypocrisy. So as Bob says, Bob,
Bob's
which one do you
fine.
like? Bob,
Bob.
as Bob said, the drug companies are funding now about 86% of the trials. They send their manuscripts to the results of those clinical trials. They send those to journals to get peer reviewed to make sure that the data are accurate and complete. The peer reviewers look at it, the articles get published, and that becomes evidence-based medicine. The sham is, and in my experience, about 1% of doctors understand this, that the peer reviewers who accredit those articles as accurate and complete do not have access to the data from the manuscripts. They are precluded from having access to the manuscripts. So what doctors are trained to accept as evidence-based medicine is simply the manufacturer's side of the story without an independent analysis. And then when you get clinical practice guidelines, you get an amalgamation of those trials that have not been peer reviewed that are then put together without access to the primary data, and with the experts not having access to the data, and with half of the experts making the guidelines getting paid by industry, and they write the guidelines that create the standards that doctors really have to follow, because if things go bad, they'll see those clinical practice guidelines in a malpractice case. So this is, it's like a bad high school play of evidence that is presented to doctors, and the doctors are trained and disciplined to follow the bottom line in the abstract, the conclusion line in the abstract, as if this information is true. And it's all a money-making scheme, because a significant portion of journals' incomes comes from the journals selling the articles that are published back to the drug maker for the drug reps to hand out to the doctors, to convince them by handing out articles that say the New England Journal or JAMA or Annals of Internal Medicine or whatever, to convince them that the drugs are good, and these journals attest to their goodness, whereas the journals are making a lot of money. 41% of the Lancet's income in 2005 came from selling reprints to drug companies. This is a major part of the journal's income. So we've got a sham and a market failure, where the journals are making money, the researchers are making money, the academic medical centers are making money, the drug companies are making money, but the public is getting bad information, and doctors are being trained and forced to accept this bad information as evidence-based medicine. And I just want to say, when we talk about evidence-based medicine, there's no evidence without data, and we don't have the data.
Yes, and one thing we used to have before the FDA got as large as it was is we did have some third-party testing, which is something we do not have today. And for example, the American Medical Association used to test drugs on their own. I'm not sure what their process was exactly, but they would then either give their seal of approval to a drug or not. And that's similar to what Underwriters Laboratory does with electrical equipment. You know, when you see that little UL on your electrical equipment, there's no law that says you can't buy electrical equipment without that UL. It's certification, not regulation. And regulation, you are forbidden to buy something without, well, in this case, FDA approval. Even if you want to, even if you think your life depends on it, you can't just go out and get the drug. You have to get the FDA's permission. And we used to have other third-party testing too. There were journals that reviewed the drugs, and there were other types of things like this evolving. And then when the FDA got its teeth, so to speak, after the thalidomide incident in the 1962 or the early 1960s, then those pretty much dried up because the FDA became the authority. So we really need to get back to third-party testing. It's the only way that we're going to get legitimate information. But as we saw during the COVID crisis, we're probably not going to get that because the US government has decided that it wants a certain narrative for drugs. And of course, that's part of a collusion. I think, John, you probably talked about this a lot in your book, I'm guessing from what you said about the interaction between government, pharma, and the medical, what they call the medical industrial complex. So, you know, without third-party testing, we really don't have good information, and we're not going to get third-party testing unless we do not have an authority like the FDA that has the ability to forbid people to take the drug that they want if they think it's going to help them. You know, if we don't have that freedom to choose, then we are not going to have third-party testing. And And in fact, what's happening today is there's some consumer organizations that are trying to get a hold of the data for cancer drugs, the Abigail Alliance, for example. And they have, I think if I'm getting this number right, they have identified 40 cancer drugs that they thought should have been approved by the FDA an average of 2 years before they were approved. And so people died waiting for these drugs. And one of the people that died was Abigail, the daughter of the man who then started this organization. So if a consumer organization can do that well, identifying drugs that should have been approved, but weren't because the FDA drags its feet, because it has the power to identify winners and losers in the pharma game, then, if as long as we have that, we are not going to get third-party testing, and we are not going to have the medical freedom to access what we want. And that's part of what's happening in the nutritional industry, is the FDA is trying to provide or trying to impose the same regulations on nutrients that it has imposed on drugs. And because those are off patent, there's no way that those trials are going to happen because they're so expensive. So
Thank you.
I'll stop there.
So just let me just clarify, just to make sure I understand this. You're saying, Dr. Abramson, you said peer reviewers don't have data from manuscripts and don't have access to primary data. So what I'm trying to understand is, if there's 1 million doctors in the country taking care of 330 million Americans, and we are all assuming that when the doctor finally makes his decision on what action you should take, whether to take a drug, not to take, which one to take, that he's doing it based on data that was totally transparent and thoroughly looked at. Are you saying, or am I not understanding this? Are you saying that when my smart doctor, who I like a lot and have known for 20 years, and my friend's doctor and everyone's doctor is making a decision, that they and the journal they read never actually looked at the real data? They just looked at the conclusion from what they were told? Like no one outside of the company, the drug company, actually ever looked at the real data of what the results said? And does this also go for the antidepressant and antipsychotic industry? Am I understanding this right? Can you clarify? Could you clarify that?
Yes, I'm sorry to tell you that you have it 100% correct. So I started to understand this in litigation, and I was at a conference, and there was not the editor-in-chief, but a high-ranking editor of a very prestigious journal at the conference, and we were walking out of the room together. And I said to him to really test this question that you've asked, Steve, because it's so discordant with what we believe. When drug companies do clinical trials, they prepare what's called a clinical study report. And they take the patient level data that's put in electrical data sets, and they tabulate that data into about a 3,000 page report. And for the most part, those clinical study reports accurately present the data. And any clinical trial that has any potential to be used for regulatory approval has a clinical study report. So I asked this journal editor, why don't you guys simply require that when the results of a clinical study are submitted to you, why don't you simply mandate that the authors of the journal, of the manuscript that's being submitted, have to send you the clinical study report so that you can do a quick verification of the results that are being sent in. It's not a total verification. You have to get the patient level data and get a statistician to do the analysis. But the clinical study report you can get through pretty quickly. So I asked him this question, and before he took the next step, he answered me, we don't do that because it would create a death spiral for the journal. Meaning the companies wouldn't submit their important clinical trials if there were greater scrutiny by that journal, and the journal wouldn't make its money from selling reprints back to the drug company to hand out to the doctors, and the journal wouldn't make money because the drug company would pull its advertising. So the journal, what he was saying was two things: is yes, to your question, that's what's happening. You're a good doctor who's working as hard as he can and being as good a doc as he can be, doesn't know that he does not have access to an independent analysis of the articles that he's reading in the most trustworthy journals. He doesn't know that. And it's craziness, because the truth is that only 1 out of 4 new drugs that's approved is significantly better than older drugs. And the doctors have no way to pick that out of the bunch. No way. So we are not practicing evidence-based medicine. We are practicing non-evidence-based medicine, and the doctors have to do that. And until there's a public outcry that says we won't do it, and until the doctors say we won't pose as learned intermediaries, we refuse to be fraudulently present ourselves to our patients as learned intermediaries because we don't have access to the science. Until that outcry is louder than the drug companies' money that they spend lobbying and buying politicians, we're going to have this enormously expensive healthcare system that produces far worse health than the other wealthy countries.
Just to add one thing real quickly. I'm not sure doctors actually read the journals much. I think what they really get is a summary, and they just learn.
I don't know if that's good news or bad news, Bob.
Everything else.
Maybe I don't even know if they read the abstracts, but anyway, there's another problem here, and that I think it begins with you also get garbage in, garbage out. And you're right, they don't have access to the case report forms, but they design those case report forms with a way to look for information that will help their drugs be successful, not identify harms, that sort of thing. And then the other thing, for example, with psychiatric drugs, I mean, we have to look at the design of the studies too, Steve, if we want to really see whether drugs are providing a benefit and how much the benefit is and that sort of thing. But like, for example, with antidepressants, you're not measuring. You don't take depressed patients and give one group who are medication naive and give one group the drug and one group the placebo. These are people so often who are chronic patients. They're on antidepressants and other drugs. And what you do is you wash out one group, and that becomes your placebo group, and the other group is put back on an antidepressant. The point is, that's a design that doesn't tell you how antidepressants are effective in medication naive patients. What it tells you is you're comparing people who've been exposed to the drugs, accustomed to drugs, are now they're put back on the same type of drug versus people going through a drug withdrawal process. And everybody knows this, but it never gets out into the public that this whole design is a problem to say so for example, are antidepressants effective in medication naive patients? We don't know. You haven't done those studies. There was a recent thing on antipsychotics. They said there's never been, antipsychotics came to market in 1955. A group of people from Columbia University said they couldn't find a single well-controlled, placebo-controlled trial in medication-naive patients. So we also have to look at the design of the studies. And are they designed really to assess the effectiveness, or are they designed to tell a story? That's part of the problem too. And also, we don't understand what efficacy means at all. What the FDA says is, can you provide a statistically significant benefit on some primary outcome? And that may be so small, it's clinically meaningless. They'll still get approval. So we have this whole society, you started with a societal story of what we believe, and what our societal beliefs are so out of sync with what really goes on in the testing and development of new drugs. It's just a totally different process.
Yeah, and if I would just add, if doctors do read the papers, they just read the abstracts. And the abstracts say something very different oftentimes than the data that's even in the paper. I think the first article I read on the impact of the COVID vaccine on pregnancy said it was perfectly safe. But if you looked at the table that showed the data, what you saw is that the first the women who were given the vaccine in the first term of pregnancy had 87% miscarriages. But that's when you averaged those few subjects relative to the second and third trimester subjects, it wasn't statistically different. So, basically the abstract took the global picture of the vaccine and pregnancy rather than breaking it down in terms. And we all know that the first trimester is the critical one. So that abstract was totally fraudulent. So even if the doctors read the papers, if they're only reading the abstract, they could be getting a very different picture than what the data actually says, to the extent that the data is in that paper. And frankly, if I had reviewed that paper, and I've reviewed many papers for journals, I would not have let that abstract stand because it was very misleading. And that is not the only paper like that I've seen. So I try to read the entire paper because I find it's very different. And that's part of the problem as well.
So just very quickly, your books came out, at different times. Is this still the practice today, or have we changed? And since your book came out, Sickening, and since this stuff's been discussed, have they changed and now they do disclose, or is this exactly the same today as it always was?
It's the same with the data, and the problem's getting worse. I mean, Bob was talking about a new antipsychotic that's approved just a few days ago. This this drug to slow down Alzheimer's disease, Leqembi, was approved in January because it had a 27% reduction in the rate at which people with early Alzheimer's progressed. That 27% was 0.45 points on an 18-point scale. And the minimum meaningful improvement is 1.63 points. So the drug's approved because approved by the FDA because the improvement is statistically significant. The FDA approves the drug. The New England Journal of Medicine publishes the article without saying it's an insignificant improvement. And this drug is projected to be prescribed for 100,000 people in 3 years, which will cost the taxpayers $2.65 billion a year. But it could go way beyond that. So this is a drug with significant harms. 1 out of 5 patients has an adverse event, and 1 out of 37 patients has an adverse event that's serious enough to land them in the hospital. So no benefit, high cost, and serious adverse events. And this is what we call high-tech, cutting-edge, innovative biotech.
So that's an FDA approval process that's totally flawed as well. So
Yes.
you have a problem with data production, you have this problem with data transparency, and then you have an approval process that'll look at some minor statistical significance on some scale and say, okay, we'll approve it, even though you have harms, you might have increased mortality, and it's clinically not noticeable. That's
Exactly.
part of
And
the
this is the point you were making about the commercial design of the study. So the statisticians that work for the pharma companies can design a study based on this scale, and they know the amount of difference they need to get statistical significance, which is all the FDA is looking for and all the journals looking for. And they know how to design that study to get a statistically significant and clinically meaningless result, and then do the marketing that creates the imperative to prescribe it.
Well, even when the data shows there's harm, as there was in the Vioxx studies, as we were talking earlier, when the person who analyzed that data looked at it, and he went to his boss and said, hey, this can't be approved because it causes heart attacks. And his boss said, well, the pharmaceutical industry is our client. And the reason is because of the 1992 Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which now supplies, last I heard, about 72% or so of the salaries of the people of the part of the FDA that approves drugs. So now we have this clear conflict of interest, which, if I sat on an IRB and I saw this kind of conflict of interest, I wouldn't allow the study to go forward, right? That would be unethical. But yet we have this setup where we have unethical conflicts of interest, and not just between the FDA and the drug companies, but also in many cases between the people who are doing the studies. And they have the people who are on the FDA advisory boards even that have conflicts of interest. So the whole system has gotten to be extremely corrupt. And that's part of what happens when you have, basically an approval system that is so authoritarian that it can't be challenged in court. And that's one of the things that happened after the 1962 amendments. The drug companies cannot sue the FDA if the FDA is being corrupt in some way, like letting one company's studies and one company's drug go forward while it holds back another one. There is no recourse. So it's a very corrupt system. It's been set up that way, and it shouldn't surprise us that this is the result.
Now, let me ask you this. Let's assume that everything you're saying is perfectly accurate. Maybe a doctor says, yeah, that this might all be true, but I don't really use clinical trials to make decisions. I base it on, my own experience. So what % of doctor decisions are based on the results of clinical trials and the articles that appear in the journals about them? And what % of their decisions are based on what they have learned on their own treating patients?
Well, there's this thing called standard of care now. And I've actually been an expert witness for doctors that have been accused of violating the standard of care, and their medical board is trying to take away their license. We didn't used to have that. Doctors were supposed to treat the individual patient. Now there's this I don't know how it evolved exactly, the standard of care. And this is the system you have to use. This is the treatment regimen you have to use. And if you don't, you can be challenged by your medical board, which of course is part of the whole system. So I think that we don't have the innovation with the doctors that we used to have, say, 30 years ago, where I never heard this before. I mean, one doctor was using a different type of suture, and his medical board was challenging him. We allow doctors to do things that we don't allow the pharmaceutical companies to do. I mean, in other words, doctors can do surgeries, they can tweak things, they can recommend off-label drugs to their patients and write prescriptions. Those doors are starting to close. So the innovation that we have in medical research that happens between the doctor and the patient is declining. And I think there's going to be more of this in the future.
Don't we, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Can I say, Steve?
Yes.
So good doctors look at their patients and they try and figure out how their patients do on drugs, and they may have 100 patients on a drug or 50 or 2. But the basic structure of clinical trials could be an excellent way to do science. Bob's pointed out the problems with having companies design their own studies, and we could have independent approval of those studies and ensure that the endpoints were well constructed to determine clinical benefit. And we could ensure that the harms were reported and that the data analysis was transparent and the peer reviewers had access to transparent analysis. And that would be a pretty good way to bring new information to a healthcare system. The problem with the way you've talked about, where doctors thinking that their observations are good enough to base decisions about clinical treatment of future patients, that's not a good way to do it. Sometimes they're going to be right, but that bypasses, that sort of throws in the trash can the entire methodology of science that could work if it were done right. And I think the problem is not solved by doctors watching their patients and trying to find conclusions, because that's why we do clinical studies. I think the problem is we have a system that's broken and corrupt all the way down, and that system has to be made to work. A decent society, a first world society in 2023 should be able to inform its doctors based on good science so that patients get the benefit of scientific innovation.
Well, I mean, I agree with you in a way, but I have to tell you, the studies don't support that conclusion. There were a bunch of studies that were done after the 62 amendments to decide, which drugs were actually effective and which weren't. And what was interesting about that is there wasn't any difference between what happened in the clinical trials as designed by, and suggested by the FDA, this business of 2 US studies that had to have a statistical significance of 0.05, and the observations that the doctors were making and how they were choosing to treat their patients. And I think the reason for that is that we used to have a system where the doctors were encouraged to pay attention to their patient and, work with the patient and see what happened when they got something, and then, change it if they didn't. Today, they're not encouraged to do that at all. They are encouraged to have this protocol, which is called standard of care. And if they don't follow it, they can get into big trouble. But that takes the innovation that we used to have in medicine away. So it's a trade-off between having the freedom to innovate. And innovation, I believe, is the best thing that we can do to improve our healthcare, because innovation is what brings us a better system of change. If we get too rigid, then we aren't going to have that innovation. And in fact, in my talk on Tuesday, I'll be talking about the price that we've paid for having this rigorous system in innovation, and it's quite shocking, actually.
Go ahead, Robert.
I just want to add one point to this thing about letting science guide us, and if we did have good, honest clinical trials. Clinical trials often show a spectrum of responses to a drug. So for example, especially with the psychiatric drugs, if you look at antidepressants, you'll see some responders, some basically nothing happens, and then some worsen. Now you could take that information and give it to doctors, and they would have to say, oh, the trial tells me I have to figure out for whom and for how long. In other words, it's not one size fits all. But what does happen right now with the way medicine is practiced, you get a drug with it, you see effect sizes are quite small, okay? In other words, there's actually quite an overlap of the bell curve of responses. But suddenly, if a drug gets approved, it's like, oh, that's what we do for everyone. And so, but we need to have the if we had honest clinical trials, they would give a nuanced presentation to doctors that would help them understand with certain drugs, you got to figure out for whom and for how long, because you don't have this universal sort of response to many drugs.
Are there certain things such as antidepressants or antipsychotics that it's been used for so long that we just know they work? It's just understood. It's part of the culture that everyone knows antidepressants are very effective. Or even do they also fall into the same category that we're not sure?
Well, I think antidepressants very much fall into this category of we're not sure. I mean, even over the short term, the benefit on scales it doesn't amount. The difference between the placebo group and the drug treated group is so small on like the HAM-D scale, it doesn't amount to what is a clinically noticeable difference. So you have that problem. The effect sizes are generally very small. And then the other thing you need to incorporate into medical advice and medical care is, and we were talking about this beforehand, a drug may have a short-term benefit, but may have a problem over the long term. In other words, these tests just study what is happening with symptoms over the short term. But if you take a drug for a long term, maybe that's going to have a very different impact on a person's health compared to what, say, natural recovery rates might be. Antidepressants, to my mind, are a really good example. Popular drugs, minimal of efficacy in these trials that are designed to favor the antidepressants. And we see all sorts of problems long-term with long-term use of these drugs. So this is a great example where clinical trials, rather than proved sort of illuminating good use of these drugs, have just led us astray. And now they're prescribed willy-nilly, and we have all sorts of problems with people on them long-term.
Well, when I last looked at antidepressants, there was a statistically significant benefit for people with a major depression. People who can't function socially, who can't go outside, can't be with their friends, can't go to work, and that you had to treat 4 patients in order for one to have a meaningful response. And major depression is a serious problem, and that's worth doing. But for people with less than major depression, there was not a significant benefit. And Steve, you're referring to everyone knows these work, but as far as I know, there's not evidence that they work for people with less than a major depression, which is a very small percentage of the people who are using the drug. Is that still the case with the data, Bob?
There's Irving Kirsch has even challenged that sort of interpretation, which initially was his own interpretation, that it was those
Yes.
more severe on the scale, that there was a significant benefit. And I think you said the NNT was 4, something like that with
Yeah,
that group.
yeah.
Irving, there's been some people have gone back and even questioned that. I would say that's open for debate in terms of how effective they are on with severe depression. But let's say if you have a severe depression, and let's say there is an NNT of 4, then you can say, try it. Because
Right.
severe depression is really debilitating. Try it. It's not going to work for everybody. And then if it doesn't work for some, then you got to try somebody else and not add on antipsychotics and this other stuff. But that's an example of nuanced medicine, right? That you've identified a group of severe patients. You have an NNT of 4. It's going to work in 1 of 4. I can become a good doctor with that information. But I'm going to be a crappy doctor if I think they work for everybody.
Robert, you're making a great point. I want to make sure the audience really gets this. When we do clinical trials, we do not know enough about genetics, environment, things like this, to do a selection of patients that is probably going to respond to the drug. So we have this large population of unknowns. And if the drug works really well for some people, like let's say it saves 2 out of 10 cancer patients, statistically, that's not going to show up. And we just, I mean, I'm a research scientist. I want to see some research, but I also recognize that we have limitations. We don't, and the way we're doing clinical trials today are not necessarily the best way that we can get information, because we still don't know enough about the nuances of the individual, which is why doctors do what you were talking about, Robert. You know, if it works for that patient, great. If they don't, they take it off and put them on something else, hopefully that will work better. And this is part of the problem. I mean, yes, we want evidence-based medicine, but unfortunately, we don't even know how to do the trials to do that, because we don't understand enough biology. I hate to say it, because of course I've worked in biology, but it seems to be the case that our knowledge is still limited. That doesn't mean we should try things. Of course we should. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do clinical trials. Of course we should. But we have to understand those limitations. And if we really want to learn, then there's got to be some freedom to innovate. And I think the way that doctors handled things in the past, where they had this freedom to innovate, I think worked better for us than the standard of care. And that's why we have such good surgery. And that's one thing we do have that's pretty good in this country, and really throughout the world. To a large extent, we have good surgery because doctors were free to innovate with surgery. They were free to try transplantation, for example. So I think it's I guess the message I want your audience to recognize is we really don't know how to do it right all the time. So we can't use a one-size-fits-all type of study to get this information. And that's very frustrating, but that's the way it is right now, I think.
Real quickly, one other thing is, in the clinical trials of antidepressants, they use inclusion criteria that exclude most real-world patients. In other words, I think 85% of depressed patients won't qualify for an antidepressant trial. And when they've done trials of NIMH-funded trials of antidepressants in real-world population, the response rates are lower. The stay well rate at the end of 1 year is much worse. So this is a problem too, is who are you testing your drugs in? Is it a representative population, or is it a selectively cultivated population most likely to respond to the drug? That's another problem as well.
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
Hi, Mary, sorry to interrupt. This is John from the IT room. Can you please maybe get closer to your microphone, because your audio is a little choppy.
Who are you talking to?
To Mary.
Oh, okay, I will. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Due to time constraints, I'm going to ask you a bunch of things, and I'd like for each of them to just give a 10-second answer. Obviously, it needs a lot of time, but we won't get to too many. So just you more or less just almost saying true and false, and you give us 10 seconds of color, okay?
Are you kidding?
We'll do our best.
Okay. What is the significance that 97% of the most frequently cited articles are commercially funded?
Okay, I put that into play. So 97% of articles, the most frequently cited articles, which means they're the articles that have the most influence on what doctors believe, have been funded by the drug companies with all the problems that Mary and Bob and I are talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, it means we have an evidence base that misleads people.
Okay. Why does it matter if in 1991, 80% of clinical trials in the United States were done in academic medical centers, but by 2004, only 26% were, and the rest were done by contract research organizations, which are for-profit companies that does the research that the drug companies design. They then conduct the research and gather the data, and they, along with, hold on a second, I'm sorry, hold on, and then along with the companies, write the report that the doctors are giving, telling them what the research showed.
Well, it used to be that the drug companies did their own studies in-house or worked with trusted physicians directly. But with the 1962 regulations changed the whole way that the studies were done, and they couldn't afford to keep staff for these clinical trials unless they had a drug that was under development. So this is how the contract research organization was born, because that way they could keep doing studies for multiple companies, and it made more economic sense. Because I remember when I was at Upjohn, we did our own studies, and towards the end of my time there, the contract research organization was becoming prominent, and the company I worked with wasn't so excited about that because they weren't sure they could trust them. But now it's the standard.
The problem arose though also when there was a time when drug companies would go to they needed to get the academic medical centers to conduct the trials, physicians, and those physicians would design the trials. So they would have to hand over control of the trial to the academic physicians. Then in the 1980s, there was a change in sort of the economics of medical schools and how much physicians could earn. And they started serving as consultants and advisors and speakers for the pharmaceutical companies, especially in psychiatry. And once that happened, those academic guys lost their independence, frankly. And they often would put their names on studies that were ghostwritten, and they lent their prestige, in essence, to a process that was designed to mislead people. So academic medical centers, doctors got corrupted as well in the 1980s because they were no longer designing trials, and they basically were captured in many ways, especially in psychiatry, by the pharmaceutical industry.
And that happened because the NIH decreased its funding for academic medical centers to do research. So the researchers had to go to the drug companies if they wanted to do what if they wanted to use their God-given skill. But I think the fundamental answer to your question, Stephen, is that when the drug companies pulled their studies out of the academic medical centers, the locus of control of the studies, design, analysis, writing up the studies and publishing the studies, the locus of control went from the independent academic medical researchers to the drug companies through the for-profit contract research organizations that they hired to do the studies.
There's just a quote here. Let's see. Hold on a second. What do you mean when you say the transformation of medical knowledge from a public good to a commodity? Please explain what that sentence means.
Well, that's my quote, so maybe I should take a shot at it. What I mean, to continue from the last question, when academic medical centers had control over the design, collection of data, analysis, the research, and publication, their mission was to provide the best information to the public possible win, lose, or draw from a business point of view for the drug companies. But now that the drug companies have control of that research, their job, they don't have a choice about this. Their job is to maximize the financial return on investment to their investors on their research endeavors, so that their job is now to create information that will, as Bob said in the very beginning, support their marketing efforts. That's the mission of their research. And so now scientific data is a commercial property that's kept confidential. The public usually can't get it unless there's litigation and the documents become unsealed in litigation. And the drug companies use this information as a marketing tool, not as a tool to improve the health of Americans or to make our healthcare more efficient or more epidemiologically targeted. It's simply an exercise to make money.
And I'd add to that when I was starting in research in the pharmaceutical industry, it was the scientists who made the decision about what to develop. As the regulations grew from the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments, the MBAs took over, and they didn't know science, and they didn't really care about science. They focused, John, as you had said, on the profit motive as opposed to what the scientists were focusing on, which was for the most part trying to get something that would help people.
Okay. Why does it matter that 96% of medical research today is about drugs and devices?
Excuse me. That's a big problem, because when our research agenda has now been turned over to the market, to for-profit companies largely, and they invest that money in order to make the most money on their research. So they invest 96% of our research money in developing drugs and devices, but only 20% of our health is actually due to medical care, and 80% is due to the social environment that we live our lives in. So we've got this market failure in the focus of our research agenda. And the reason why this matters is because doctors are trained to practice so-called evidence-based medicine. And when 96% of the evidence is about drugs and devices, they think and they are compelled to practice medicine in accord with that. So we've got an enormous epidemiological misdirection of our healthcare, which is part of the reason why we're spending an extra $2.3 trillion a year compared to other wealthy nations on our healthcare, yet we have very significantly worse health outcomes.
I would just add to what John said that we do have a switch from prevention to treatment-based medicine, which again was the result of the 1962 amendments, which I'll be talking about tomorrow. And that really, I agree with John, that's really 80% of what we should be focusing on, but we're no longer focusing on it because essentially the FDA is trying to outlaw prevention by trying to apply the drug standards that it has to things like nutraceuticals.
How do drug researchers make money on patents and royalties? And can a researcher for a nonprofit that got government money receive patents and royalties? And why does any of this even matter?
Well, my understanding is that the government does, even government employees can receive royalties on patents. And this changed, I believe, in the 80s, because what was happening is, again, partially due to these 1962 regulations, there weren't many new drugs coming about. So at that time, academics couldn't patent their research. So that changed in the 80s. And so now that the academics could patent their research, they could then license it to the pharmaceutical companies and make quite a bit of money doing so. And of course, a lot of this was taxpayer funded. So the idea was maybe that wasn't such a good idea, but since the drugs were drying up relative to where they had been before, that's a solution that they came upon. And so in a sense, they converted academics from trying to do research to simply learn things to trying to make a profit. So it switched academic research quite a bit.
Correct. Go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to see, I mean, the reason for this, you can sort of understand the reason for this. The idea was to turn basic discovery into useful drugs. And the thought was by, providing this economic incentive, and that the academic researcher could then work with the drug company to develop it. So I think there was a rationale for it, to turn basic science knowledge into, therapies that were beneficial.
Right, Robert, there was, but what happened was the price of getting the FDA approval had grown so huge that they weren't able to develop, drug companies, even when they were doing their own research, couldn't develop enough drugs to stay solvent, so to speak. So they had to turn to the academia to get those. And of course, that was the solution, the idea of the solution, but in a sense, it kind of backfired in some ways. So again, I don't want to keep beating on this, but these 62 regulations were really extremely detrimental and caused a lot of the problems we're seeing today. And only if we know that can we fix it, because it's hard to fix if you don't know what caused the problem in the first place.
So these regulations came out of the Bayh-Dole Act, which was approved in 1980, that gave academic researchers the right to commercialize their patents and keep the money. And I agree in large part with what Mary is saying, is this creates a very, and Bob, it creates a very strong incentive for innovation. But what it does is it changes the fundamental mission of the university. So instead of the university seeking truth and fulfilling the obligation of its nonprofit status to be of service to the American people, it turns the university and its researchers into entrepreneurs. And you can make a lot of money selling these expensive drugs that we're talking about, Leqembi or the antipsychotics that cost so much. You can make a lot of money commercializing those instead of figuring out the kinds of social activities that we can engage in to prevent dementia or to treat psychosis in more effective and community-based ways. So it undermines the role of the university, and there's no other institutions in America that can come in and do that function of nonprofit universities. So we lost that. It's gone.
I agree. It's gone.
What does the healthy life expectancy show for the United States? Why are we ranked 68th, and why did it decrease in the last 10 years?
Well, we have the most obese population in the world, I think, or pretty close to it. And we don't encourage nutrition. It was interesting that, during the COVID crisis, for example, we knew that patients that had comorbidities were the most in trouble. And a lot of those comorbidities were things like hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, things that people could change by a more healthy lifestyle. They also were many papers out showing that the ones who survived a COVID crisis were the ones that had high vitamin D levels. That is super cheap to, vitamin D, it is really cheap and inexpensive, and it protected people. So none of this, we heard none of this from our government. It really failed us, I think, there, because we could have saved a lot of people. And this is continuing on, is that our whole society is kind of, an indulgent society, and maybe that's too harsh a word, but we eat a lot, we don't eat the right things, we don't exercise. So, in Europe, for example, they don't have all the elevators we have. They don't have, generally they don't have a lot of cars. They walk to a subway or a train station or whatever. In other words, they get more exercise. In some of the northern, like the Danish communities, they are on a bicycle a lot. It's a very different lifestyle.
Stephen, the fact about peer reviewers not getting the data is shocking, but the most shocking finding, I think, of all, is that the life expectancy of Americans is now equivalent to what the life expectancy of 10 comparable countries was in 1987. We are spending $2.3 trillion a year extra, And the life expectancy of Americans was the life expectancy of the other 10 countries in 1987, when they were spending about $1,000 per person on healthcare, and we're now spending $12,900 on healthcare. It's just such a shocking failure of our system. I just want to sort of scream from the highest soapbox. We've got to fix this. It's ruining our country. It's ruining our health. It's sucking away our money. It's undermining our democracy. And this is the biggest problem we have. And you don't ever see it in the newspaper. It's not covered in the mainstream media. And it's a total crisis.
Okay.
You take it so well.
Why have the drug companies paid $38 billion in fines from 1991 to 2017?
Well, in
Well-
part, it's because they put some bad drugs on the market, like Vioxx, for example, and ended up having to pay a lot of money because of that.
Well, it's also for the fraudulent marketing of drugs, particularly off label, and hiding adverse events and that sort of thing. So they were paying fines for the fraudulent marketing of drugs beyond what they're allowed to do within the FDA usual boundaries. At least, John, you're the one who's done all the lawsuits, but basically that's where the reason for the fraud and for the fines, right? Fraudulent marketing
Yeah,
of the
that's
drugs.
exactly right. So the litigation that I consult in is civil litigation. People are either trying to collect money because they were injured, or people who purchased drugs based on fraudulent information are trying to recoup their money. So I did participate in civil litigation involving a cousin of Vioxx called Bextra. And I understood what the drug company did to misrepresent the safety and efficacy of their drug. And I picked up the phone and blindly called the Department of Justice and said, I know something about Bextra, but I can't tell you because I've signed a confidentiality agreement. So a federal marshal appeared with a subpoena, a federal subpoena, for me to appear at FBI headquarters with my computer and tell the FBI and the DOJ what I knew. The manufacturer was apprised of this and didn't intervene, didn't stop. So I told them what I knew and didn't hear anything else about it. They keep their cards very close to their chest. And 6 months later, there was a press release from the DOJ that Pfizer had been fined $1.195 billion, the largest fine in US history for a criminal fine for any reason. And so I know in that case, though I can't tell you, but it's exactly what Bob said. It was fraudulent marketing, but I can't tell you the details.
If someone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Did you want to say something, Robert?
Oh, no, I was just going to say one of the interesting things about the fines is the individuals, the officers of the company, they don't suffer from this. So yeah, they pay these big fines, but they've already generated a lot of revenue from the sale of the drugs. Often they have stock options. The stock prices went up with the blockbuster sales. So the punishment didn't fit the crime, so to speak, because people actually individuals benefited from the fraudulent marketing. I mean, one of the companies that paid fines was Eli Lilly for its marketing of Zyprexa. Well, I looked at what happened to the stock prices when they launched Zyprexa and did off-label marketing, and I looked at the stock options that the officers of the company got, and they made millions of dollars from that fraudulent marketing, and they never paid any price for having done that fraudulent marketing. I mean, so that's part of the reason is they pay huge fines, but it really doesn't exact a toll on individuals, or it hasn't so far.
Okay.
And when the companies are found guilty or make an agreement, plead guilty to a felony, usually the Department of Justice allows a subsidiary of the main drug company to take the plea and to pay the fine. So when a subsidiary takes the plea, it means that the drug company isn't one step closer to getting disbarred from Medicare and not allowed to sell its drugs. So even when they're busted and they're guilty and they pay huge fines, the company isn't at risk.
Okay, if you could each take 1 minute to give me a summation of closing thoughts that you want to leave our audience with to sum up the most important points that you want to make sure we understood from everything that you're aware of. So, Mary, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I'd like to leave with your listeners today the idea that the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Food and Drug Act were responsible for reshaping the pharmaceutical industry, changing medical practice from prevention to treatment, and really costing each of us about 5 to 10 years of our lives. And we can actually calculate that because there are studies that give us the information to do so. And if you want to know more, please come to my talk on Tuesday and I will share what I know and you can see if you agree or maybe you'll have some other ideas.
And Mary, how do we stay in touch with you? If someone wants to follow up with you, what's the best way? To your website, your books, how do they stay in touch with you?
The best way is probably to email me. My email address is really simple. It's Mary@Ruwart, which is my last name, RUWART.com. And please put in the subject line, question about your talk that I heard on, the truth about health, so that because I get hundreds of emails each day, I answer all of them, but I have to see that you're not spam. The way I do that is I look for your name. If I don't recognize it, I look at the subject line. So please put something in the subject line that alerts me to where you're coming from. And if you don't hear from me in 72 hours, please try again.
Okay, so we put that in the chat box. You can also click on her picture on our website, but her email is in the chat box also. Thank you very much, Mary. Robert, do you want to give us your summation?
Well, my quick summation is, we have a broken system. We have this story out there that doctors are practicing evidence-based medicine. They're not practicing evidence-based medicine because the evidence is tainted. And what we see is we have healthcare being delivered in a capitalistic system right now. We're spending 20% of our GDP on this and we're not getting the returns. So obviously we need to do something different. And basically we have a system that is right now taking a great toll on our health. It's in our children's health as well. A lot of our children, they're struggling with psychiatric disorders, this disorder, that disorder. So we don't have a system that nurtures health in our population. We have a system that is designed to identify disease. And as we identify disease, we are applying treatments that really are not founded in a good scientific assessment of the risks and benefits. So it's a broken system and it is exacting a big toll on our society.
And how can we stay in touch with you, get your books, your website? How do we follow up with you?
Mary, I'm easy to reach. You can just reach me at Robert.B.Whitaker@iCloud.com. And I answer all the emails I get. Sometimes it takes me a few days, all lowercase.
Can we post that in the chat? Say that one more time, Robert.
Yeah, it's Robert, all lowercase, Robert.B as in boy, Whitaker, WHITAKER @iCloud.com. And sometimes it takes me a few days, but I answer everybody who writes.
Okay, and you can also go to our website and click on it to get to follow up with him, but also in the chat box, we have his information. So thank you very much, Robert. Dr. Abramson, what's your final thoughts?
My final thoughts are what Bob said. I think he nailed it exactly right. We've got an enormous problem with the role of medicine in an advanced capitalist society. And the guardrails are off. The companies are doing everything they can do to maximize their profits, and they're doing a damn good job. And until we put guardrails on it, it's going to keep going, and they're going to make us sicker, and they're going to take more money from us. And until the American people understand this well enough to rise up and create a political force that is more powerful than the money that the pharmaceutical companies pour into our politics, this situation is going to get worse and worse. It's a crisis of, I think, historic proportion, and we've all got to start to become activists in whatever way we feel is within our style and our capability. I plead that we take this seriously and that we start to educate our friends and family and workers and colleagues about these issues.
Okay, and how do we stay in touch with you or get your books or follow up with you?
My email address is lowercase John, John, Abramson, Abramson, MD, all one word, @gmail.com. And I return my emails. Sometimes I'm slow, and if I don't get back to you, give me a week. Write again, please. And like Mary said, please put in the subject line that it's relevant to this program.
Okay, and you can go to our website and click on Dr. Abramson's picture and name, and that'll take you to his book and his information. So I want to unmute everyone. We want to thank you. We really appreciate it. You guys are amazing. Thank you for doing all this work and sharing it so generously with all of us. And we would all like to take the opportunity to thank you. So
Like
Thank
three little.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
You've been
very
You're
much.
the best.
Thank
Thank
you
you very much.
Anything that
Thank
you're
you.
being a
You're
warrior.
Everybody
You
did.
I mean,
Love you
behind
very
it.
little
much.
serve
Thank you
wrapper.
for
In other words,
Thanks again.